I never thought I'd be spilling my life's mess to a complete stranger, let alone a taxi driver. But sometimes life's twists and turns leave you with no choice. Today, I'm going to tell you something that shook my world to its core. The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday afternoon in Chicago, the kind of relentless downpour that turns the streets into rivers and makes you question every decision that brought you outside. I stood on the corner of Michigan Avenue, clutching my purse against my chest, my coat soaked through, watching taxis pass by with their off-duty lights glowing like tiny rejections. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. I had just left the lawyer's office where I'd finally seen the documents, the proof of everything I'd suspected but refused to believe for so long. My husband Thomas and I had been married for 42 years, and in those pages, I discovered that for at least the last 15, he'd been systematically transferring our money, our retirement, our life savings into accounts I didn't even know existed. Accounts with my daughter Rebecca's name on them. Accounts that funded my son Michael's business ventures while I clipped coupons and turned down invitations because I thought we couldn't afford them. Attorney Morrison's office had smelled like old leather and expensive wood polish. The kind of place that charged by the quarter hour and made you feel like your problems were being taken seriously simply by existing within its walls. He'd laid the documents out on his massive mahogany desk one by one, like a dealer revealing a particularly bad hand of cards. Each statement felt like a betrayal wrapped in official letterhead. I remember staring at one particular transfer. $65,000 moved from our joint retirement account to an investment fund under Rebecca's name, dated just 3 months after I'd asked Thomas if we could afford to replace the ancient furnace that kept breaking down. He'd told me we needed to wait another year, that money was tight, that we had to be careful. And all the while, he was moving enough money to buy 3 new furnaces into our daughter's account. Morrison had watched me with those careful lawyer eyes, the ones that have seen every kind of human tragedy and learned not to react. But I caught a flicker of something when I started crying. Not gentle tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from somewhere deep in your chest, the kind that makes your whole body shake. He'd pushed a box of tissues across the desk without a word, and I'd taken 3, 4, 5 of them, trying to mop up tears that wouldn't stop coming. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said quietly, "I need you to understand something. What we're looking at here constitutes elder financial abuse. This isn't just a family disagreement about money. This is systematic exploitation." The word exploitation had hit me like a slap. It made it real in a way that all my private suspicions hadn't. Exploitation meant I was a victim. It meant I hadn't been crazy or oversensitive or ungrateful like Thomas always suggested. It meant the gnawing feeling in my gut for all these years had been right. When a yellow cab finally pulled over, I climbed in without even checking if the driver was going my direction. I just needed to sit down. I needed to be anywhere but standing on that corner where the world felt like it was tilting sideways. The driver was a woman, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes that met mine in the rearview mirror. She asked me where I was headed, and I opened my mouth to give her my address in Lincoln Park. But what came out instead was a sob, just one, sharp and painful, like something breaking inside my chest. And then I started talking. I told her everything. I know this might sound strange, pouring my heart out to someone I'd never see again, but maybe that's exactly why it felt safe. She listened without judgment as I told her about the papers still crammed in my purse, about the meeting with Attorney Morrison, who had looked at me with such pity when he explained what my own family had done. If you're listening to this and you haven't subscribed yet, please do. These stories need to be heard, and your support helps them reach people who might be living through their own silent betrayals. Hit that subscribe button because what I'm about to share might save someone you love from the same heartbreak I endured. The driver's name was Carmen, and she kept driving, not really going anywhere, just circling blocks while the meter ran and the rain drummed on the roof. She told me to take my time, that she wasn't in a hurry. I remember noticing the small photograph hanging from her rearview mirror, a young girl in a graduation cap, and thinking about my own grandchildren, about Emma who was starting college next fall, about how I'd been saving my grocery money to help with her tuition while my husband and children were draining accounts that should have been mine too. "Take a breath, honey," Carmen said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd heard hard stories before. "Start from the beginning if you need to. Sometimes the only way to make sense of the end is to go back to where it all started." So I did. I told her about the early years, about how Thomas and I had met at a community dance when I was barely 21, how he'd seemed so stable and responsible, how my mother had approved of him because he had a good job and came from a decent family. I told her how we'd built our life together slowly, carefully, saving for our first house, celebrating when Thomas got his contractor's license, welcoming our babies into a world we thought we were making safe and secure. He was different then, I heard myself saying, watching the rain-blurred city slide past the windows. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe I just couldn't see who he really was because I was too busy trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect everything. I thought back to when it all started, or at least when I should have noticed. It was probably 7 years ago, maybe 8. Thomas had always handled our finances. That was just how we did things. He worked as a construction manager, built up a successful contracting business over the years, and I had worked as a school secretary until I retired at 62. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, or so I thought. We had our house paid off, our retirement accounts, some investments. Thomas would show me statements sometimes, give me updates, and I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, the father of my children, the man I'd built a life with since I was 23 years old. But looking back now, I can see the signs I ignored. The way he started insisting I didn't need to be on certain accounts because it was simpler for tax purposes. The way Rebecca would mention things, expensive things, a new car, a kitchen renovation, a vacation to Europe, and when I'd express surprise at how they could afford it, Thomas would get defensive, tell me it was none of my business how our adult children managed their money. The way Michael's restaurant kept getting capital injections, while simultaneously Thomas would tell me we needed to cut back, that we couldn't afford to replace the washing machine that was held together with duct tape and prayer. I remember one particular afternoon, it must have been 3 years ago, I was going through some papers in Thomas's office looking for our insurance information because I had a dentist appointment. I found a statement from an investment account I didn't recognize. It had over $300,000 in it, and Rebecca's name was listed as the beneficiary. When I asked Thomas about it, he got angry in a way I'd rarely seen. He told me I was snooping, that I didn't understand how estate planning worked, that he was protecting our assets for when we were gone. He made me feel small, stupid, like I was overreacting by simply asking a question about our own money. I apologized. Can you believe that? I apologized to him for finding evidence of his betrayal. Carmen made a sound in the front seat, something between a sigh and a growl. "My ex-husband used to do that," she said. "Make me feel crazy for noticing things that were actually happening. It's a special kind of cruelty, making someone doubt their own reality." Her words gave me permission to keep going, to voice things I'd never said aloud before. I told her about the night I'd found Thomas's phone unlocked on the kitchen counter, how I'd seen a text thread with Rebecca. Just business stuff, I'd told myself, but I'd caught one message that said, "Mom's been asking about the Schwab account again. You need to keep her distracted." And Rebecca's response, "Don't worry, I'll ask her to watch the kids this weekend. She'll forget all about it." That's what they do, you see. They make you doubt yourself. They turn your reasonable questions into character flaws. They gaslight you until you can't trust your own instincts anymore. And because I loved him, because I'd spent 4 decades building a life with this man, I chose to believe his explanations. I chose to push down the doubt that gnawed at me in the quiet hours of the night when he was snoring beside me and I was staring at the ceiling, wondering why I felt so uneasy in my own marriage. The exploitation wasn't just financial. It was the constant expectation that I would be available, always. Rebecca would call me at 7 in the morning asking if I could watch her kids because her nanny was sick, and if I had plans, if I mentioned that I'd arranged to have coffee with my friend Patricia, She'd sigh in that particular way that made me feel selfish for having a life outside of serving my family. Michael would show up at our house unannounced with bags of laundry, saying his washer was broken again, and he'd leave them in the basement for me to deal with while Thomas told me I should be grateful our son still wanted to come around, that I should stop complaining about doing a few loads of clothes. I told Carmen about the time Michael had called me on a Saturday morning, his voice cheerful and casual. "Hey, Mom, I'm having a little get-together tonight. Nothing fancy. Can you come over early and help me prep? Maybe around 2? I'd agreed because that's what I did. I showed up at his beautiful condo at 2 o'clock with my arms full of grocery bags, ingredients I'd bought with my own meager money because he'd been vague about what he needed. I spent 6 hours in his kitchen, chopping vegetables, marinating meat, baking appetizers from scratch. The party started at 8. By 8:30, when I was exhausted and ready to sit down, Michael pulled me aside. "Mom, thanks so much for all this. You're amazing. But the thing is, this is kind of a young crowd, you know? Might be kind of boring for you. I can call you a cab home if you want." He dismissed me from a party I'd spent 6 hours preparing for, sent me home like hired help whose services were no longer required. And I'd gone, too tired to protest, too conditioned to accept this treatment to even recognize how abnormal it was. My birthdays became afterthoughts. Last year, my 67th birthday, I spent the entire day alone. Thomas said he had a work emergency, some crisis at a job site that required his immediate attention. Rebecca texted me happy birthday with a string of emojis at noon. Michael called 3 days later, apologized for forgetting, said he'd make it up to me. He never did. I sat in our living room that evening, the same living room where we'd celebrated so many holidays, so many milestones, and I ate a piece of grocery store cake by myself while watching the sun set through the window. I remember thinking how quiet the house was, how empty it felt, and wondering when exactly I had become so alone in a life surrounded by family. "Did you tell them?" Carmen asked softly. "Did you tell them how much that hurt?" I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised me. "I tried once. Rebecca said I was being dramatic, that adults don't make a big deal about birthdays. She said I should be happy that everyone was healthy and doing well, that I was being selfish for expecting some big celebration at my age. But I kept forgiving them. That's what you do, isn't it? That's what I was taught by my own mother, who stayed with my father through his drinking and his rage and his infidelities because you just didn't give up on family. You forgave. You endured. You sacrificed yourself on the altar of familial duty, and you told yourself it was love, that it was strength, that it was what good wives and mothers did. I absorbed that lesson so deeply it became part of my DNA, this belief that my worth was measured by how much I could tolerate, how much I could give, how little I could need. I gave them everything. When Rebecca was going through her divorce 8 years ago, Thomas and I paid for her lawyer, covered her rent for 6 months, took care of her children every weekend so she could have time to herself. We gave her $15,000, money we'd saved for a trip to Ireland we'd been planning for years. We never took that trip. When Michael wanted to open his restaurant, his dream project, we took out a second mortgage on our house, the one we'd finally paid off after 30 years. We gave him $80,000, and he promised he'd pay us back once the business was profitable. It's been 5 years. The restaurant did well for a while, well enough that Michael bought a boat. Well enough that he and his wife Sarah moved into a condo in River North with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman. But somehow, there was never enough profit to pay back his parents. Carmen had pulled into a parking lot by this point, turned off the meter, and turned around to face me directly. "Let me guess," she said. "When you asked about the money, they made you feel guilty for even bringing it up." "Exactly," I whispered. "Michael said I was treating him like a business transaction instead of my son. He said real families don't keep score like that, and I believed him. I felt ashamed for even asking." I worked part-time jobs even after I retired because I wanted to contribute, because Thomas kept saying money was tight, because I felt guilty spending anything on myself when we supposedly had so little. I cleaned houses for neighbors. I did bookkeeping for a small nonprofit. I babysat for families in our building. I'd come home exhausted, my knees aching from scrubbing floors, my eyes strained from staring at spreadsheets, and Thomas would barely look up from his phone to acknowledge I'd walked in the door. The money I made went into our joint account, the one Thomas managed, the one that I now know was being slowly drained to fund the separate lives my family was living without me. One particularly vivid memory surfaced as I talked to Carmen. It was a Tuesday evening, I remember, because I'd worked all day cleaning the Hendersons' house, a massive 4-bedroom that took me 7 hours to get through. My back was screaming. My hands were raw from cleaning solutions, and I'd earned $120. I'd come home to find Thomas in the living room with Rebecca and Michael, the three of them laughing about something on Michael's phone. I'd walked in and announced, probably too proudly, that I'd made good money that day, that I could contribute to our grocery budget for the month. The laughter had stopped. Thomas had looked at me with something like disgust. "You're bragging about cleaning toilets? At your age, you should be embarrassed, not proud." Rebecca had nodded in agreement, added that it reflected poorly on the family that I had to work like that people might think they weren't taking care of me. Michael had at least had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he hadn't defended me. I'd gone to our bedroom and cried, but quietly, so they wouldn't hear. The shame I felt that night was overwhelming. They'd twisted my pride and honest work into something humiliating, made me feel pathetic for contributing, all while they were draining hundreds of thousands of dollars from accounts I didn't even know existed. There were moments when the mask would slip, when I'd catch a glimpse of the truth beneath the performance. Like the time I overheard Rebecca on the phone with Michael, talking about their dad's latest transfer, laughing about how they needed to be careful not to seem too eager or I might start asking questions. I was in the kitchen making Thanksgiving dinner, my hands covered in flour from the pie crust I was rolling out, and they were in the dining room, not even bothering to lower their voices because I'd become so invisible to them they forgot I had ears. When I walked in with the cranberry sauce, they went silent, shared a look, and Rebecca changed the subject so smoothly I almost convinced myself I'd misheard. Or the time I found a credit card statement in Thomas's jacket pocket while I was taking it to the dry cleaner. Charges for jewelry I'd never received, expensive dinners at restaurants he'd told me we couldn't afford, hotel rooms in cities he'd supposedly visited for work. When I confronted him, he didn't even try hard to lie. He said the jewelry was for Rebecca's birthday. The dinners were client meetings. The hotels were necessary because the job sites were far from home. His explanations were lazy, barely coherent, and yet I accepted them because the alternative was too painful to consider. The alternative meant admitting that the man I'd loved for 42 years, the man I'd trusted with everything, saw me as nothing more than a convenience, a source of domestic labor and financial manipulation. I started having panic attacks, though I didn't recognize them as such at the time. I'd be grocery shopping, comparing prices on canned tomatoes like I always did, and suddenly my chest would tighten, my vision would blur, and I'd have to grip the shopping cart to keep from falling. My doctor prescribed medication for anxiety, suggested therapy, but Thomas said therapy was for people who couldn't handle their own problems, that I just needed to relax, maybe take up yoga or meditation. So I swallowed the pills and tried to breathe through the attacks and told myself I was fine, everything was fine. I was just being dramatic. My body was trying to tell me what my mind refused to accept. I started having headaches that lasted for days, migraines that made me nauseous and sensitive to light. I developed insomnia, lying awake until 3 and 4 in the morning, my mind racing with worries I couldn't name. I lost weight because food tasted like ash in my mouth, because my stomach was constantly churning with an anxiety I couldn't articulate. My hair started falling out in clumps in the shower, and when I mentioned it to Thomas, he said I was getting old, that these things happened, that I should be grateful I still had most of my hair at my age. Carmen handed me a bottle of water from the front seat. "Drink this," she said, "and listen to me. What you're describing, what they did to you, that's abuse. You know that, right?" I took the water with shaking hands. "I know that now, But for so long, I couldn't see it. Or I didn't want to see it. I want you to understand something. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't weak, despite what they made me feel. I was a woman who had been systematically conditioned over decades to doubt herself, to prioritize everyone else's needs and comfort above her own, to believe that questioning or demanding respect was selfish and ungrateful. This conditioning didn't happen overnight. It was the accumulation of thousands of small moments, tiny cuts that individually seemed insignificant, but together carved away at my sense of self until I barely recognized who I'd become. I stopped seeing my friends. It happened gradually. Patricia would invite me to lunch, and I'd cancel because Rebecca needed me to babysit. Dorothy would suggest we go to a movie, and I'd decline because Thomas had planned something, though often that something would be him going to a Bears game with Michael while I stayed home alone. Eventually, they stopped inviting me, and I didn't blame them. Who wants a friend who's always canceling, always unavailable, always putting everyone else first? The isolation made everything worse. Without outside perspectives, without people who might point out how abnormal my situation had become, I had nothing to measure my reality against except the distorted version my family presented. They became my entire world, and in that world, I was the problem. I was too demanding for wanting basic respect. I was too controlling for asking about finances. I was too sensitive for having feelings about being forgotten and dismissed and used. Then came the health crisis that changed everything. It started with what I thought was a bad case of indigestion. I was making dinner, nothing fancy, just chicken and vegetables, and suddenly I couldn't breathe. The pain in my chest was crushing, radiating down my left arm, and I just knew something was terribly wrong. I called for Thomas, but he was in his office with the door closed, on one of his endless phone calls. I managed to dial 911 before I collapsed on the kitchen floor, the phone still in my hand, watching the ceiling spin above me. The paramedics arrived within minutes. Thomas came out of his office annoyed at the commotion, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he saw me on the floor, surrounded by EMTs. It wasn't concern. It wasn't fear for my well-being. It was irritation, like I was inconveniencing him with my medical emergency. I remember one of the paramedics, a young man with kind eyes, asking Thomas how long I'd been on the floor. Thomas had shrugged. I don't know. I was on an important call. The paramedic's jaw had tightened, but he'd remained professional, turning his attention back to me. Ma'am, can you tell me your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? 8, I'd gasped. Maybe 9. In the ambulance, drifting in and out of consciousness, I heard one of the paramedics talking about my vital signs, about how lucky I was that I'd called when I did, about how another 10 minutes might have been too late. I remember thinking, in that foggy, pain-filled moment, that Thomas wouldn't have found me for hours. He would have stayed in his office on his important call, and I would have died on our kitchen floor, and he wouldn't have even known until he came out looking for dinner. At the hospital, they ran tests. It wasn't a heart attack, thank God, but it was a severe anxiety-induced event, something they called broken heart syndrome, where extreme stress can actually mimic the symptoms of a heart attack. The doctor, a young woman with gentle hands and concerned eyes, asked me about my life, about what was causing such extreme stress. And sitting there in that hospital bed, with monitors beeping and an IV in my arm, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of illness and fear, I finally told someone the truth. I told her about the money, about the isolation, about the constant demands and the complete lack of reciprocation. I told her about feeling like a servant in my own home, about how my family treated me like an ATM and a babysitter and a housekeeper, but never like a person with needs and feelings and worth. And she listened, really listened, and when I was done, she said something that cracked me open. She said, "You know this isn't normal, right? You know you deserve better than this." It seems so obvious now, but in that moment, it was revolutionary. I deserved better. What a concept. The doctor recommended I speak with the hospital social worker before I was discharged, And that conversation led to another revelation. The social worker helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of elder abuse, that financial exploitation by family members was far more common than people realized, that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. The social worker, a woman named Janet with gray hair and warm brown eyes, had pulled up a chair next to my hospital bed. "Margaret," she'd said, using my first name in a way that felt respectful rather than familiar, "I need you to hear something. What you've described to me constitutes elder abuse, financial, emotional, and potentially physical abuse given the health crisis you just experienced." "But they're my family," I'd protested weakly. "They don't mean to hurt me." Janet had shaken her head firmly. "Intent doesn't negate impact. Whether they mean to hurt you or not, they are hurting you. They're exploiting you. And the fact that they're your family makes it worse, not better, because you should be able to trust them above everyone else." She'd given me pamphlets, resources, phone numbers for lawyers who specialized in elder abuse cases. I'd taken them with trembling hands and shoved them into my purse, certain I'd never use them but unable to throw them away. When Thomas came to pick me up from the hospital, he was on his phone the entire time. Barely glanced at the discharge papers, complained about having to take time off work. On the drive home, he didn't ask how I was feeling. He told me that I'd scared him, that I needed to get my stress under control, that these dramatics were getting old. Dramatics. I'd nearly died from the stress of being abused by my own family, and he called it dramatics. That night, while Thomas snored in our bed, I went down to his office. My hands were shaking as I opened his filing cabinet, as I went through folders and statements and documents I'd been trained not to question. And there it all was. Account after account, in Rebecca's name, in Michael's name, transfers and withdrawals and loans that were never meant to be repaid. Our retirement fund that should have had over $500,000 in it had less than $60,000. The investments we'd supposedly been building for our future didn't exist. The life insurance policy I thought would protect me if something happened to Thomas had been cashed out 3 years ago, the money used to fund Michael's restaurant expansion. I sat on the floor of that office surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't just hurt, though the pain was crushing. It was clarity. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I saw my situation clearly, without the fog of denial and hope and desperate love obscuring the truth. My husband had been stealing from me. My children had been complicit, and I had been letting it happen because I was too afraid of losing them to demand they treat me with basic human decency. I took photos of everything with my phone, every statement, every transfer, every piece of evidence. Then I put it all back exactly as I'd found it and went upstairs to bed. I didn't sleep, but I lay there in the darkness, and I planned. The hospital social worker had given me a card for a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. In the morning, I would call him. I would start protecting myself, even if it meant destroying the family I'd sacrificed everything to maintain. By the time I finished telling Carmen all of this, we'd been sitting in that parking lot for over an hour. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. My throat was raw from talking, my eyes swollen from crying, but I felt lighter somehow, like speaking these truths aloud had released some of the poison they'd been creating inside me. That's where my story was when I got into Carmen's taxi 6 weeks later, after months of secret meetings with Attorney Morrison. After gathering evidence and building a case, and finally putting myself first. Carmen drove me home eventually, after I'd talked myself hoarse, after the rain had stopped and the sun was starting to break through the clouds. When she pulled up to my building, she turned around and looked at me directly. She said, "My mother went through something similar. She never fought back. She died still trying to earn love from people who only saw her as a resource. Don't be like her. Don't waste whatever time you have left trying to fix people who don't want to be fixed." I paid her, added a tip that was probably too large, and watched her drive away. Then I went upstairs to my apartment, where Thomas was watching television like it was any other day, and I knew that everything was about to change. But not yet. Not quite yet. First, I had to give them one final test, one last chance to show me that maybe, just maybe, I'd been wrong about the depths of their selfishness. It was Emma who became my unexpected ally, my grandchild who saw through the performance everyone else was so invested in maintaining. She'd come over one Saturday afternoon, dropped off by Rebecca, who had errands to run and needed a babysitter. Emma was 16, smart and observant in that way teenagers can be when they're not absorbed in their phones, and she found me in the kitchen, staring at the wall, tears streaming down my face. I'd just gotten off the phone with Rebecca, who'd called to ask if I could loan her $5,000 for some emergency she was vague about. When I'd hesitated, when I'd said I needed to think about it, she'd gotten cold in that particular way she had, said she thought she could count on her mother, that family was supposed to help each other. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Family was supposed to help each other. But that obligation only ever seemed to flow one direction. Emma sat down at the kitchen table and asked me what was wrong. And because I was so tired, so worn down from carrying this burden alone, I told her. Not everything, but enough. I told her that I felt used, that I felt like the people I loved didn't really see me as a person, just as someone who could provide things for them. I told her I was tired of being taken advantage of, tired of being expected to give and give and give while receiving nothing in return. She was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I'd said too much. Maybe I'd burdened this child with adult problems she shouldn't have to think about. But then she said, "Grandma, why do you let them do this to you? You're always giving them money and watching kids and doing favors, and they're never there for you. Mom talks about you like you're this obligation she has to deal with, not like you're her mother." The words hit me like a physical blow, but also like a liberation. Someone else saw it. Someone else recognized what was happening. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't making it up. I wasn't being overly sensitive. This child could see what I'd been denying for years. We talked for hours that afternoon. Emma told me things I hadn't known, conversations she'd overheard, the way her mother and uncle talked about me when they thought no one was listening. She told me about the money her mother had spent on designer handbags while claiming she couldn't afford to contribute to Emma's college fund, about the vacation to Cancun her uncle had taken last month while telling me he couldn't pay back any of the loan we'd given him. "Last week," Emma said, her voice trembling with anger, "I heard Mom on the phone with Uncle Michael. They were laughing about how you'd agreed to clean Mrs. Henderson's house again. Mom said, 'At least it keeps her busy and out of our hair.' Like you're some kind of burden instead of their mother who's literally scrubbing toilets to help them." The betrayal of hearing this from Emma hurt, but it also validated every instinctual feeling I'd been taught to ignore. My own daughter was mocking me for working to support the family that was stealing from me. She told me she'd been angry on my behalf for a while, watching how they treated me, but she hadn't known what to say or if it was her place to say anything. "Grandma," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "you deserve so much better than this. You're kind and generous, and you've given them everything, and they just take and take. It's not fair. It's not right." That conversation with Emma gave me something I desperately needed. It gave me validation, yes, but more than that, it gave me hope that not everyone in my family was lost to greed and selfishness. Here was this young woman, still forming her own values and understanding of the world, and she could recognize injustice when she saw it. She could feel empathy and outrage on behalf of someone else. If there was hope for Emma, then maybe my sacrifice hadn't been completely in vain. Maybe I'd modeled something for her, even if it was what not to tolerate. I asked Emma not to say anything to her mother about our conversation, and she agreed, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She started coming over more often after that, sometimes with excuses about needing help with homework or wanting to learn how to cook, but really just to check on me, to make sure I was okay. It was the first time in years I felt like someone in my family actually cared about my well-being, without wanting something in return. The final test came 2 weeks later. I told Thomas, Rebecca, and Michael that I needed to talk to them about something important. I asked them to come over for dinner on a Saturday evening, said I'd cook their favorite meals. They agreed, though Rebecca complained about having to get a babysitter, and Michael said he could only stay for an hour because he had plans. I spent the day cooking. Pot roast for Thomas, the way I'd made it for 40 years with carrots and potatoes and that specific blend of spices he liked. Rebecca's favorite pasta dish, the one I used to make for her birthday when she was little. Michael's preferred dessert, a chocolate cake that took hours to make from scratch. I set the table with our good china, the set we'd gotten as a wedding gift and only used for special occasions. I put out fresh flowers, lit candles, created the kind of warm, inviting atmosphere I'd spent decades perfecting. They arrived separately, each exactly on time, which should have told me something. Rebecca came in complaining about traffic, immediately checked her phone. Michael kissed my cheek distractedly, asked if there was beer in the fridge. Thomas didn't even greet me, just sat down in his usual chair and turned on the television. I served dinner, and we ate in near silence, broken only by their occasional comments about their own lives. Rebecca talked about a trip she was planning to Miami. Michael mentioned he was thinking about opening a second restaurant location. Thomas grunted responses and ate steadily, barely tasting the food I'd spent all day preparing. None of them asked me anything, not how I was feeling, not what I'd been doing, not why I'd called this family dinner. Finally, after we'd finished eating and I'd cleared the plates, I sat back down at the table. I said I needed to talk to them about something serious. I said that I'd been feeling taken advantage of lately, that I needed them to understand I couldn't keep being their source of money and free labor without any reciprocation or appreciation. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried to present my concerns rationally and without accusation, but I could feel my hands shaking as I spoke. The response was immediate and devastating. Rebecca's face went cold, that look she got when someone wasn't giving her what she wanted. She said I was being dramatic, that everyone in the family helped each other, that she couldn't believe I was keeping score like this. Michael actually laughed, said I was acting like they'd asked me for millions when it was just small amounts here and there to help out. Thomas told me to stop making a scene, that I was embarrassing myself. I tried to push back, to explain that I wasn't trying to keep score. I just wanted to feel valued and respected. But Rebecca talked over me, her voice rising. She said I'd always been like this, always playing the martyr, always acting like I did so much when really I was just doing what mothers were supposed to do. She said if I didn't want to help my own children, fine, she'd find other people who actually cared about family. "You know what your problem is, Mom?" Rebecca had said, her eyes flashing with an anger that seemed disproportionate to my gentle request for basic respect. "You think you're entitled to constant praise for doing the bare minimum? You're a mother. You're a grandmother. This is what you're supposed to do. I don't get medals for taking care of my kids, and you don't get medals for helping your family." The comparison was so absurd, it would have been funny if it weren't so painful. She was equating me caring for my own young children decades ago with her exploiting her elderly mother now. She was willfully blind to the difference. Michael's phone rang and he answered it, right there at the table. Had a whole conversation about meeting up with friends while I sat there trying to have this important discussion. When he hung up, he said he had to go. He was already late. He kissed my cheek again, that same distracted gesture, and he was gone before I could say anything else. Thomas waited until the door closed behind Michael, then stood up and told me I'd ruined a perfectly nice evening with my complaints. He said I needed to get over myself, that I was lucky to have a family that still wanted to spend time with me at my age, that plenty of women would be grateful for what I had. Then he went into his office and closed the door, leaving me alone with Rebecca. She was on her phone, texting, barely paying attention. I said her name, tried one more time to reach her, to make her understand how much pain I was in. She looked up, and for just a second I thought I saw something in her eyes, some flicker of recognition or guilt. But then it was gone, and she said she had to go pick up her kids from the babysitter. She said we'd talk later, though we both knew we wouldn't. After they left, I sat at that dining room table surrounded by dirty dishes and wilting flowers and the remnants of a meal no one had appreciated, and I felt something inside me finally break. Not shatter exactly, more like a chain snapping, a lock opening. I wasn't sad anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was done. I spent that night going through all my financial documents, all the evidence I'd gathered, all the photos I'd taken. I organized everything into a folder and made copies of all of it. I drafted an email to Attorney Morrison laying out exactly what I wanted to do. Then I went into Thomas's office, where he'd fallen asleep in his chair with his phone still in his hand, and I took photographs of his computer screen, his open files, the physical evidence that he hadn't even bothered to hide anymore because he'd gotten so comfortable in his deception. The next morning, I went to the bank. I opened new accounts in only my name at a different institution. I transferred the money that was left in our joint accounts, the money I'd earned from my part-time jobs, the disability payment I received from my years working for the school district. It wasn't much, maybe $12,000 total, but it was mine. I closed our joint credit cards and opened new ones. I changed the passwords on all my email accounts and my phone. Then I went to Attorney Morrison's office and I filed for divorce. I also filed a civil lawsuit against Thomas, Rebecca, and Michael for financial exploitation. Morrison explained that these cases were difficult to prove, that family members often got away with this kind of abuse because victims were too scared or too ashamed to fight back. But he said I had good documentation, and more importantly, I had the courage to actually go through with it. The process of serving the divorce papers was complicated because I was still living with Thomas, still sleeping in the same bed, still pretending everything was normal while the legal machinery churned behind the scenes. It was surreal, this double life I was living. By day, I was the same accommodating wife and mother I'd always been. By night, I was building a case that would dismantle my family. Those weeks of waiting for the papers to be served were some of the most psychologically challenging of my life. I had to smile at Thomas over breakfast while knowing I was about to blow up his comfortable existence. I had to listen to Rebecca complain about her trivial problems while knowing I was preparing legal action against her. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I held on to my resolve by reminding myself of every betrayal, every dismissal, every moment they'd treated me as less than human. I told Emma what I was doing. She cried, but she also said she understood, that she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. She asked if this meant she wouldn't see me anymore, and I promised her that would never happen, that she could come visit me whenever she wanted, that I would always be her grandmother no matter what happened with the rest of the family. "Grandma," she'd said, hugging me tightly, "you're the bravest person I know. Most people would just take it, but you're fighting back. You're showing me that it's okay to demand respect, even from people you love." Her words had made me cry, but they were good tears, healing tears. If nothing else came from this nightmare, at least Emma would learn that love without respect isn't really love at all. The confrontation I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure happened 3 weeks later when the papers were finally served. Thomas came home from work holding the envelope, his face red with rage. He threw it on the kitchen table where I was sitting, pretending to read a book, and demanded to know what the hell I thought I was doing. I looked up at him, this man I'd spent most of my life with, and I felt nothing but a hollow kind of calm. I said I was doing what I should have done years ago. I was protecting myself from people who only valued me for what I could give them. I was establishing boundaries and demanding respect, and if that meant ending our marriage, then so be it. He laughed, actually laughed, and said I'd never survive on my own. He said I had no money, no job, no prospects. He said I was a fool if I thought I could take him to court and win. He said Rebecca and Michael would never forgive me for this, that I was destroying our family over nothing, over my own selfishness and inability to appreciate what I had. I let him rage. I'd heard it all before in different forms, these same accusations and manipulations dressed up as concern or love. When he finally ran out of steam, when he was standing there breathing hard and waiting for me to apologize, to back down, to fold the way I always had, I stood up and walked to his office. I pulled out the folder I'd hidden in my purse, the one with copies of all the financial documents, all the evidence of his theft. I laid it on his desk, and I told him to look at it. I told him I knew everything, every account, every transfer, every lie. I told him I had documentation of it all, and I'd given copies to my lawyer, and if he wanted to fight this in court, I welcomed it, because I had nothing left to lose, and he had everything. His face went pale. He picked up the folder with shaking hands, flipped through it, and I watched the realization dawn that he'd been caught, that his comfortable arrangement was over. He tried to explain, started stammering about how it was all for the family, about how he was protecting our assets, but I held up my hand and told him to stop. I said I didn't want to hear his excuses anymore. I said I'd spent 42 years listening to his excuses and his lies and his justifications for treating me like I didn't matter, and I was done. I said he had a choice. He could agree to a fair divorce settlement, give me half of what was rightfully mine anyway, and we could end this civilly, or we could go to court, and I would make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of man he was, what kind of father he'd been, how he'd stolen from his own wife to fund his children's lifestyles. He chose to fight, of course. Men like Thomas always do. They can't stand the idea of their victims having agency, having the audacity to demand justice. Rebecca and Michael closed ranks around their father, hired their own lawyers, tried to paint me as mentally unstable, as a vengeful woman making false accusations. They told friends and extended family that I'd had some kind of breakdown, that I was going through something and making wild claims about abuse that had never happened. The isolation that followed was crushing in its completeness. People I'd known for decades, friends I'd shared meals with and celebrated holidays with, suddenly stopped calling. Some believed the stories my family was spreading. Others just didn't want to get involved in family drama. I'd go to church on Sundays, the same church I'd attended for 30 years, and people would avoid eye contact, would hurry past me without saying hello. One Sunday, I ran into Helen Morrison, a woman I'd served on the church hospitality committee with for years. I thought we were friends. When I smiled and approached her, she'd literally turned and walked the other way. Later, I'd overheard her talking to another parishioner. I heard she's trying to take everything from her poor husband and children, after all they've done for her. It's shameful. The urge to scream the truth at these people was overwhelming, but Attorney Morrison had advised me to maintain dignity and silence. Let them believe what they want, he'd said. The truth will come out in court, and then they'll all look like fools for doubting you. But I also discovered I was stronger than I'd known. I found a therapist who specialized in recovery from family abuse, and slowly, painfully, I started unpacking all the ways I'd been conditioned to accept mistreatment. Dr. Sarah Chen had an office in a converted brownstone in Wicker Park, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that invited vulnerability. In our first session, I'd barely made it through the door before I started crying. She'd handed me tissues and said, "Take all the time you need. This is your space. Your feelings are valid here." Over the months that followed, Dr. Chen helped me understand the psychology of abuse, the way it creeps in gradually, normalizing itself until you can't remember what healthy relationships look like. She taught me about trauma bonding, about how the intermittent moments of kindness from my family had kept me hooked, always hoping the next interaction would be different. She helped me see how my childhood had primed me for this, how my mother's martyrdom had taught me that suffering was synonymous with love. Your family trained you to believe that your needs were inherently selfish, Dr. Chen said during one particularly difficult session. They conditioned you to feel guilty for the basic human desire to be treated with respect, That's not love. That's control, masquerading as family values. I joined a support group for older adults dealing with family exploitation, and I discovered I wasn't alone, that there were dozens of people in Chicago alone going through similar situations, being drained dry by their children and spouses and relatives who saw them as resources rather than people. The group met every Thursday evening in the basement of a community center, a circle of folding chairs occupied by people who understood my pain without needing explanation. One woman in the group, Margaret, had given her daughter over $200,000 over the course of 10 years, money she'd saved for retirement, money she now desperately needed for medical expenses. She was 73, living in a studio apartment she could barely afford, while her daughter owned a vacation home in Wisconsin. Margaret told us about the time she'd asked her daughter for help with her rent, just $50 to make it through the month, and her daughter had lectured her about financial responsibility. Another man, Robert, had worked until he was 75 to support his adult son's drug habit, and when he'd finally said no more, his son had robbed him and disappeared. Robert hadn't heard from his son in 3 years, didn't know if he was alive or dead, and the guilt of cutting him off still woke him up at night, even though everyone in the group assured him he'd done the right thing. There was Linda, who'd raised her grandson for 15 years while her daughter got her life together, only to have the daughter show up on the boy's 16th birthday and take him away, cutting off all contact. There was Frank, whose wife and adult children had convinced him he was developing dementia so they could take over his finances, when in reality, he was perfectly healthy, but they wanted access to his pension. These stories were heartbreaking, but they were also validating. They reminded me that what had happened to me wasn't personal, wasn't unique, wasn't somehow my fault. Every Thursday, we'd share our progress and our setbacks, celebrating small victories like saying no to an unreasonable request or establishing a boundary without apologizing for it. We'd cry together, laugh together, remind each other that choosing ourselves didn't make us bad people. It made us survivors. The legal process dragged on for months. There were depositions and hearings and endless paperwork. Attorney Morrison was patient and thorough, but he warned me repeatedly that these cases rarely resulted in criminal charges, that the best I could hope for was a financial settlement and maybe, if I was lucky, some accountability. I told him that was enough. I didn't need Thomas or my children to go to jail. I just needed them to acknowledge what they'd done, to face consequences for their actions, to understand that I was a person deserving of respect. The depositions were brutal. I had to sit in a conference room across from Thomas and his lawyer, answering questions designed to make me look vindictive, mentally unstable, or greedy. Thomas's lawyer was a sharp-dressed man who spoke in a condescending tone, implying that I was simply a bitter ex-wife trying to punish my husband for some imagined slight. He asked me if I'd been taking my anxiety medication regularly, if I'd considered that my memory of events might be skewed by my emotional state, if I understood the difference between joint marital assets and personal accounts. Attorney Morrison objected frequently, his voice steady and professional, but I could see the anger in his eyes. During a break, he told me I was doing great, that I should keep telling the truth, that the evidence would speak for itself. "They're trying to rattle you," he said. "They want you to get emotional, to seem unstable. But you're doing perfectly. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and remember that you have documentation they can't refute." Rebecca's deposition was even harder. Sitting across from my daughter, watching her lie with such ease, such conviction, was one of the most painful experiences of my life. She claimed she had no knowledge of any financial arrangements between her father and herself, that any money she'd received had been gifts freely given, that she'd certainly never discussed keeping me in the dark about anything. When Morrison presented her with copies of the text messages I'd found, the ones where she and her father discussed keeping me distracted, she claimed they'd been taken out of context, that I was misinterpreting innocent conversations. Michael's deposition was shorter. He was clearly uncomfortable, couldn't maintain eye contact, kept contradicting himself. His lawyer had to call for breaks 3 times because Michael was getting flustered. I almost felt sorry for him until I remembered the $80,000, the boat, the River North condo, all funded by money that should have been securing my retirement. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thomas's business partner, a man named Jack, who I'd known socially for years, reached out to Attorney Morrison with information. Apparently, Thomas had been doing the same thing to their business that he'd done to our marriage, siphoning off money, hiding assets, making unauthorized transfers. Jack had his own lawyers looking into it, and he was willing to share financial records that corroborated my claims. With this new evidence, the case against Thomas became airtight. His lawyer advised him to settle, and finally, after 8 months of fighting, he agreed. The settlement gave me half of everything we'd accumulated during our marriage, which, after accounting for what he'd stolen and hidden, amounted to about $400,000. It wasn't the retirement I'd planned, wasn't the comfortable future I'd envisioned, but it was enough. It was mine. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in October, almost exactly a year after I'd gotten into Carmen's taxi and spilled my secrets to a stranger. I stood in the courthouse with Attorney Morrison beside me, and when the judge declared our marriage dissolved, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. I was free. For the first time in over 4 decades, I was truly free. Rebecca and Michael contested the financial exploitation lawsuit, and that case is still pending. Attorney Morrison says it could take another year or more, says they'll probably settle eventually rather than risk a trial. I told him I'm not in a hurry. I've waited this long for justice. I can wait a little longer. The most painful part of all of this has been the complete severing of my relationship with my children. Rebecca sent me one email after the divorce was finalized, a cold, formal message saying that she could never forgive me for what I'd done to Dad, that I'd destroyed our family for money, that she never wanted to speak to me again. Michael didn't even send an email. He just blocked my number, unfriended me on social media, erased me from his life as thoroughly as if I'd never existed. But I still have Emma. She comes over every Saturday, helps me grocery shop, tells me about school and her friends and her plans for college. She says her mother doesn't know she's still seeing me, and I tell her I don't want to come between them, but she insists. She says someone needs to make sure I'm okay, and besides, she enjoys spending time with me. It's the first time in years that time with a family member hasn't felt like an obligation or a transaction. We just exist together, 2 people who care about each other, no hidden agendas or unspoken demands. I've started building a new life. I moved out of the house I shared with Thomas and into a smaller apartment in a different neighborhood, a bright 1-bedroom with big windows that let in the morning sun. The apartment is in Andersonville, a vibrant neighborhood I'd always loved, but Thomas had dismissed as too expensive and too far from his work. Now, it's mine. I chose every piece of furniture myself, decorated the walls with art I actually like instead of the bland landscapes Thomas preferred. I bought colorful throw pillows and plants that fill the windowsills, creating a space that feels alive and welcoming in a way our old house never did. The first night I spent there alone, I made myself dinner, just a simple pasta dish. But I ate it at my own pace, didn't rush to clean up, didn't worry about anyone criticizing how I'd prepared it. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the street below, people walking their dogs, couples holding hands, the ordinary magic of a neighborhood going about its evening. And I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Contentment. Not happiness exactly. Not yet, but a quiet satisfaction in simply existing without fear or obligation. I've been volunteering at a literacy program for adults, helping people learn to read and write, and the work fills me with a sense of purpose I haven't felt in years. My first student was a woman named Maria, 52 years old, who'd immigrated from Guatemala 20 years ago and had always been too embarrassed to admit she couldn't read English. Watching her sound out her first complete sentence, seeing the pride and joy on her face, reminded me that I had value beyond what I could provide to my family. I was helping someone achieve a dream, not because I owed them something or because they were manipulating me, but because I chose to, because it brought meaning to my life. I've reconnected with Patricia and Dorothy, my old friends who'd stopped inviting me places, and I've apologized for disappearing, explained what was happening in my life. They've welcomed me back with open arms, no judgment, just relief that I'm okay and happiness to have their friend back. Patricia had cried when I called her, said she'd been so worried but hadn't known how to reach me. I knew something was wrong, she'd said. You just disappeared, and every time I did manage to talk to you, you seemed so tired, so defeated. But when I asked if you were okay, you always said you were fine, and I didn't want to push. We met for lunch at a cafe near my new apartment, the three of us together for the first time in years. I told them everything, and instead of the judgment I'd feared, they responded with outrage on my behalf. Dorothy, who'd gone through her own difficult divorce 10 years earlier, squeezed my hand and said, "I'm so proud of you for leaving. So many women stay, convince themselves it will get better, and waste their precious years on people who don't deserve them." Now we meet every week, sometimes for lunch, sometimes for walks along the lakefront, sometimes just for coffee and conversation. We talk about books and politics and our grandchildren, but also about our fears and hopes and the ways we're learning to live fully in this chapter of our lives. They've become not just friends, but a chosen family, people who see me and value me for who I am, not what I can do for them. I've started therapy not just for trauma recovery, but for personal growth. My therapist has been helping me understand the patterns that led me to accept abuse for so long, the childhood experiences that taught me my worth was conditional on my usefulness to others. It's painful work, excavating all these old wounds, but it's also liberating. I'm learning who I am outside of the roles I've played for others. I'm learning what I like, what I want, what I need. I'm learning that it's okay to put myself first sometimes, that self-care isn't selfish, that boundaries aren't walls but bridges to healthier relationships. I've even started dating, which feels strange and exciting and terrifying all at once. There's a man named David who volunteers at the literacy program, a widower around my age who makes me laugh and listens when I talk, and never, not once, has asked me for money or a favor or anything beyond my company. We've been on a few dates, nothing serious yet, but it's nice to feel seen and valued and desired in a way that has nothing to do with what I can provide. Our first date was coffee, neutral and safe, at a little shop in Edgewater. We talked for 3 hours, and when I realized how late it had gotten, I started to apologize for taking up so much of his time. He'd looked confused and said, "Why are you apologizing? This is the best conversation I've had in months. I'm the one who should be thanking you." That simple exchange made me realize how deeply programmed I was to apologize for existing, for taking up space, for having needs and wants. David didn't see time spent with me as a burden or an obligation. He enjoyed my company. What a revolutionary concept. On our third date, he took me to an art museum, and we wandered through the galleries talking about the paintings, sharing our interpretations and reactions. At one point, I mentioned that I'd always wanted to take an art class, but Thomas had said it was a waste of money. David stopped walking and turned to look at me. "You should take an art class," he said simply. "You should do all the things you've wanted to do. Life's too short to keep putting yourself last." That night, when he dropped me off at my apartment, he kissed my cheek and said he'd like to see me again. I said yes, and I meant it, not because I needed him to complete me or save me, but because I genuinely enjoyed his company and wanted to see where this could go. It was the first time in my adult life I'd entered into something romantic from a place of wholeness rather than need. I think about Thomas sometimes, about whether he ever reflects on what he lost. I think about Rebecca and Michael, about whether they understand the damage they've done. But mostly, I don't think about them at all. I'm too busy living, actually living, for the first time in decades. I'm making choices based on what I want, not what everyone else needs from me. I'm spending money on things that bring me joy without guilt or fear. I'm saying no without apology when people ask for things I don't want to give. Last month, I did something I dreamed about for years. I booked a trip to Ireland, the trip Thomas and I had planned before we gave that money to Rebecca. I went alone, spent 2 weeks exploring Dublin and the countryside, staying in cozy bed and breakfasts, talking to locals, taking photographs of landscapes that took my breath away. On my last night in Galway, I sat in a pub listening to traditional music, drinking Guinness, and I realized I was happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I couldn't remember being before. I've also started taking that art class David suggested. Every Tuesday evening, I go to a community center and paint with a group of other beginners. I'm terrible at it. My landscapes look like abstract blobs and my portraits could be anyone, but it doesn't matter. I'm creating something just for the joy of creating it, not because anyone needs it or expects it from me. My teacher, a kind woman named Rachel, tells me to stop apologizing for my work, to embrace the imperfection, to understand that art is about the process, not the product. I've learned to recognize the triggers that used to send me into spirals of anxiety and self-doubt. When I catch myself thinking I'm being selfish for prioritizing my needs, I stop and ask myself, would I judge someone else harshly for doing what I'm doing? The answer is always no. I'm learning to extend to myself the same compassion and understanding I've always freely given to others. There are hard days, of course. Days when I miss the idea of family, when I see mothers and daughters shopping together, or grandparents at the park with grandchildren, and I feel the loss acutely. Days when I wonder if I was too harsh, if I should have tried harder to make it work. But then I remember the panic attacks, the hospital bed, the years of feeling invisible and used, and I know I made the right choice. I remember that the family I was mourning never really existed except in my imagination, that I was grieving a fantasy, not a reality. There's a research study I came across recently that said approximately 1 in 5 nursing home residents experiences neglect at least once per year, and that nearly 40% of seniors have experienced verbal abuse from family members or caregivers. When I read those statistics, I felt both heartbroken and validated. Heartbroken because it confirmed that what happened to me is part of a much larger epidemic of elder abuse, that there are countless others suffering in silence, too ashamed or too scared to speak up. Validated because it meant I wasn't alone, wasn't crazy, wasn't making a big deal out of nothing. I wish I could go back and tell my younger self, the woman who was just starting to notice the red flags but was too afraid to acknowledge them, that she deserved better. That love isn't supposed to hurt, that family isn't supposed to drain you dry, that there's nothing noble about sacrificing yourself for people who don't appreciate or reciprocate. But I can't go back. All I can do is move forward and hope that by sharing my story, I might help someone else recognize their own situation before it's too late. The taxi ride with Carmen feels like a lifetime ago, but I still think about what she said, about her mother who died still trying to earn love from people who only saw her as a resource. I think about how close I came to being that woman, to spending my final years in service to people who didn't value me, to dying without ever standing up for myself. And I'm grateful, so deeply grateful, that I found the courage to change my story's ending. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself in my experience, if you're dealing with family members who exploit you financially or emotionally, if you feel trapped in relationships where you give everything and receive nothing in return, please know that it's not too late to change course. You deserve respect. You deserve reciprocity. You deserve to live a life where you're valued for who you are, not what you can provide. And there are resources available, support groups and therapists and lawyers who specialize in helping people break free from these toxic dynamics. It won't be easy. The path to liberation is painful and scary and lonely at times. You'll lose people you love or thought you loved. You'll face judgment and criticism and accusations. You'll doubt yourself, wonder if you're making the right choice, question whether you're being too harsh or too demanding. But on the other side of that pain is freedom, is peace, is the possibility of building a life that's truly yours, not one that exists solely in service to others. I'm 68 years old now, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm excited about the future. I don't know exactly what it holds, but I know it's mine to shape. I'm not anyone's ATM or babysitter or domestic servant anymore. I'm just me, a woman who survived, who fought back, who reclaimed her life and her dignity and her right to exist as a whole person deserving of love and respect. The wound my family inflicted won't ever fully heal. There will always be a scar, always be moments when I feel the loss of those relationships acutely. But scars are evidence of survival, proof that we endured something that should have destroyed us and came out the other side. And I'm proud of my scars. I earned them. They're part of my story, but they're not the end of it. I want to end with a question for anyone listening who might be going through something similar. Have you experienced this kind of exploitation or emotional abuse from family members? Have you felt trapped in relationships where your worth is measured only by what you can give? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments to create a space where we can support each other and remind each other that we're not alone in this struggle. And if this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel less alone or gave you courage to examine your own relationships, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. These stories need to be told, need to be heard by people who are still suffering in silence, who think they're the only ones going through this. Every share, every comment, every like helps ensure that this message reaches someone who desperately needs